I never thought a summer camp counsellor job would change my life, but here I am, lying in the dark with my heart pounding so hard I'm sure Mason can hear it from his bunk across from mine. Let me back up and tell you how I got here, how a simple hand reaching out under a blanket turned my entire world upside down. My name is Dylan, and 3 months ago, I was just another 22-year-old college graduate with no real plan, no job prospects, and a lot of questions I wasn't ready to answer about myself. When my mum suggested I apply to be a counsellor at Camp Riverside, the same place I'd gone as a kid, I figured why not? It was a paycheck, it was outdoors, and it would buy me time to figure out what came next. I never expected to meet someone who would make me finally understand what everyone meant when they talked about falling in love. The first day of counsellor training, I walked into the main lodge and saw him. Mason was standing by the window, sunlight catching the copper highlights in his brown hair, laughing at something another counsellor had said. He had this energy about him, this warmth that seemed to fill the whole room. When he turned and our eyes met, he smiled at me, and I felt something shift in my chest. I told myself it was just nerves about the new job. I'd gotten pretty good at lying to myself by then. We got assigned as bunkmates in the counsellor's cabin, which meant we'd be sharing a small room with 2 twin beds for the next 8 weeks. That first night, as we unpacked our stuff and made awkward small talk, I kept sneaking glances at him. The way he moved, the sound of his laugh, the casual confidence in how he existed in his own skin. I found myself noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice about guys. The curve of his shoulders when he pulled off his shirt to change, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how his voice got softer and more thoughtful when he talked about why he wanted to work with kids. Mason was studying to be a teacher, taking a year off before grad school. He told me about growing up in a small town, about his big Italian family, about how he'd always known he wanted to work with children. He asked about me too, actually listened when I talked, remembered details from conversations we'd had days before. It was the kind of attention that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to. The first week of camp was chaos. 27 kids between the ages of 8 and 12, all hopped up on sugar and freedom, running around from dawn until lights out. Mason and I were co-counselors for the same group, which meant we spent every waking moment together. We developed this rhythm, this unspoken communication, where we could manage the kids with just a look or a subtle gesture. He'd catch my eye across the campfire, and I'd know exactly what he was thinking. When one of our campers, a quiet kid named Tommy, was homesick and crying, Mason sat with him for an hour, and I felt something warm and tender bloom in my chest, watching him be so gentle and patient. At night, after the kids were asleep and we'd collapse into our respective bunks, we'd talk in the darkness. Real talk, the kind I'd never had with my friends back home. Mason told me about his breakup with his ex-girlfriend 6 months ago, how he'd realised he'd been going through the motions, feeling like something fundamental was missing. He talked about feeling lost, about questioning things he thought he'd figured out. I shared more than I meant to, about feeling disconnected from my own life, about always feeling like I was performing a role rather than actually living. He got it in a way no one else ever had. 2 weeks in, we had our first day off together. Most of the counsellors went into town, but Mason suggested we hike up to the ridge overlooking the lake. It was a steep climb, and by the time we reached the top we were both sweating and breathless. We sat on the rocks, passing a water bottle back and forth, and looked out at the view. The lake was this perfect mirror of blue, surrounded by pine trees, and the whole world felt quiet and still. That's when Mason said something that made my heart stop. He said, "Dylan, can I ask you something personal?" And I nodded, even though every instinct told me to deflect, to change the subject, to protect myself. He asked, "Have you ever felt like you were supposed to want something? Like everyone expected you to want it? But when you really examined your feelings, it just wasn't there?" I knew exactly what he meant, but I wasn't brave enough to say it out loud yet. Instead, I just said, "Yeah, I have." He looked at me for a long moment, and I swear something passed between us, some acknowledgement of a truth neither of us was ready to speak. After that day, things shifted. Not dramatically, but in small ways that made my heart race. Mason started finding excuses to touch me. A hand on my shoulder when he passed behind me. Sitting close enough that our knees touched during campfire. Standing near enough that I could feel the heat from his body. I told myself I was imagining it, reading into innocent gestures, but late at night I'd lie awake replaying every moment, every look, every touch. 3 weeks into camp, we had a massive thunderstorm. The kind where the sky turns green and the rain comes down so hard you can barely see. All the kids were freaked out, so we gathered them in the main lodge for an impromptu movie night. Mason and I sat in the back, ostensibly to keep an eye on everyone, but really we were just sitting together in the semi-darkness, shoulders pressed together, and I was acutely aware of every point where our bodies touched. At one point he leaned over and whispered something about one of the kids, his breath warm against my ear, and I had to close my eyes against the rush of feeling that went through me. That night, back in our cabin, we couldn't sleep. The storm was still raging, rain pounding on the roof, thunder rolling across the valley. Mason said, "This weather makes me feel weirdly nostalgic, like I'm a kid again, you know?" I said I knew what he meant. Then he said, "I'm glad I'm here with you, not just in general, but right now, in this moment." The way he said it, the weight behind the words, made something crack open inside me. I said, "Mason," and then stopped, because I didn't know how to finish that sentence. I didn't know how to tell him that I thought about him constantly, that I'd started to realise the feelings I'd been pushing down my whole life were rising up, and they all had his face attached to them. He sat up in his bunk and looked at me through the darkness. I could barely see him, just the outline of his shape, but I could feel his attention like a physical thing. He said, "Dylan, I need to tell you something, and I've been trying to figure out how to say it, and I'm just going to say it because I think if I don't say it now I'll lose my nerve." My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. He said, "I think about you all the time, like all the time. And I know that might be weird to hear, and if I'm completely misreading this situation you can absolutely tell me and we'll never speak of it again. But I feel like there's something here, between us." And I had to at least say it out loud. I couldn't breathe. I literally forgot how to breathe for a second. Then I said, "You're not misreading it." My voice came out rough and unsteady. I said, "I think about you too, all the time. I didn't know I could feel like this about someone." The words felt like they were being pulled out of me, like I was finally saying something true after years of careful lies. Mason got out of his bunk. He crossed the small space between us and sat on the edge of my bed. I could see him better now, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. He was looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Vulnerable and hopeful and scared all at once. He said, "Can I?" and then stopped. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. He reached out and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine, and that simple touch felt like the most significant thing that had ever happened to me. We sat like that for a while, just holding hands, neither of us speaking. His palm was warm against mine, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. Finally he said, "I've never felt like this about a guy before. I mean, I've wondered, I've thought about it, but I've never actually felt it until you." I said, "Me neither. This is all new for me. Scary new." He squeezed my hand. He said, "We don't have to figure everything out right now. We don't have to label it or define it or tell anyone. We can just be here, together, and see what this is." That felt like permission to breathe again, to not have all the answers immediately. I said, "Okay." Then, because I was feeling brave in the darkness, I said, "Will you stay here? Just for tonight?" He climbed into my narrow twin bed, and we rearranged ourselves until we were lying facing each other, still holding hands, our faces inches apart. I could feel his breath on my skin. He said, "Is this okay?" I said, "This is more than okay. This is the most okay I've ever felt about anything." He smiled, and even in the darkness I could see it, could feel the warmth of it. We fell asleep like that, hands clasped between us, and when I woke up in the middle of the night he was still there, his forehead pressed against mine, and I felt this overwhelming sense of rightness, like I'd been walking around my whole life slightly out of alignment and suddenly everything had clicked into place. The next morning was awkward in the best way. We woke up tangled together, and for a second we both froze, reality crashing back in. Then Mason smiled at me, that soft morning smile, and said, "Good morning," and everything felt okay again. We had to get up and face the kids and the other counsellors and act normal, but we kept catching each other's eyes across the dining hall, these secret smiles that felt like a language only we spoke. Over the next few weeks, we figured out how to be together in the small spaces we could steal. Late-night talks that turned into gentle kisses. Sitting together by the lake after the kids were in bed, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against him. Early morning hikes where we'd find a secluded spot and just be ourselves. No performance, no hiding. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered conversation felt like discovering something new about myself, about what I wanted, about who I was when I stopped trying to be what everyone expected. Mason was patient with me in a way I desperately needed. When I'd panic about what this meant, about how to tell my family about whether I was really gay or bi or just confused, he'd hold my hand and remind me that I didn't need to have it all figured out. He said, "You're Dylan, and I'm falling for you, and that's enough for right now. The labels and the coming out and the big conversations, they'll happen when you're ready. There's no rush." But it wasn't all smooth. One night, about 5 weeks into camp, we had a fight. One of the other counsellors, this girl named Emma, had been flirting with me all day. She was nice, pretty, exactly the kind of girl I would have forced myself to be interested in before. I'd been friendly back, not flirting exactly, but not shutting it down either. Old habits, old fears, old instincts to hide. That night, Mason was quiet, distant. When I asked what was wrong, he said, "Nothing," but I could feel the wall between us. Finally, lying in our separate bunks in the darkness, he said, "I get that this is complicated for you. I get that you're figuring things out. But it hurts watching you pretend I don't exist when other people are around. It hurts feeling like you're ashamed of this, of us." His voice cracked on the last word, and hearing his pain I'd caused felt like a knife to the chest. I got out of my bed and went to his. I said, "I'm not ashamed of you. I'm scared, and that's different, but I'm not ashamed. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm sorry I made you feel like you weren't." He sat up, and I could see tears on his cheeks in the moonlight coming through the window. I'd never seen him cry before. I reached out and wiped them away with my thumb, and he leaned into my touch. I said, "I'll do better, I promise. I'll work on the fear thing, because losing you would be worse than anything else I'm afraid of." He pulled me close and we held each other, and I felt something solidify in me, some determination to be braver, to stop hiding from the truth of who I was and what I wanted. After that, I was more intentional. I didn't broadcast our relationship to the whole camp, but I stopped actively hiding it. When Emma flirted with me the next day, I gently told her I was interested in someone else. When the counsellors went into town and Mason and I wanted to split off together, I didn't make elaborate excuses. Small steps, but they mattered. I could see it in the way Mason looked at me, the pride and appreciation in his eyes. With 2 weeks left of camp, we took another hike up to the ridge. We'd been there several times by then, and it had become our place. We sat on the same rock where we'd had our first real conversation, and Mason said, "I need to tell you something." My stomach dropped, prepared for bad news. He said, "I'm falling in love with you. I think I have been for weeks, but I wanted to be sure before I said it. I'm sure now." I looked at him, at this person who'd seen me more clearly than anyone ever had, who'd been patient with my fears and gentle with my heart, who'd helped me discover parts of myself I'd kept locked away. I said, "I love you too." I didn't even know I could feel this way about anyone. The words felt huge and terrifying and absolutely true. He kissed me then, soft and sweet, and I kissed him back, and we sat there on that ridge holding each other as the sun started to set over the lake. He said, "What happens when camp ends?" I'd been trying not to think about that, about the real world waiting for us, but I knew we needed to talk about it. I said, "I don't know exactly, but I know I don't want this to end. I want to figure out how to make this work." Mason said he was moving to the city for grad school in the fall, the same city where I'd been planning to look for jobs. We made plans, tentative and hopeful. He'd find an apartment, I'd crash with friends until I found work, and we'd see where this went. No promises we couldn't keep, but a genuine intention to try. That felt like enough. The last night of camp, after all the kids had gone home and the other counsellors were having a bonfire on the beach, Mason and I stayed in our cabin. We lay in my bunk together, the same narrow twin bed where this had all started, and talked about everything and nothing. He told me he was proud of me, of how much I'd grown over the summer. I told him he'd changed my life, helped me become someone I actually wanted to be. I said, "Remember that first night after the storm when you held my hand?" He nodded, his fingers finding mine under the blanket. The same gesture that had started everything. I said that was the moment I knew, the moment I... When your hand found mine in the dark and it felt like coming home. He smiled and said, I knew before that, but that was the moment I let myself believe you might feel it too. We fell asleep wrapped around each other, and in the morning we packed up our stuff and said goodbye to the camp that had given us each other. The drive home was bittersweet, both of us quiet, holding hands across the centre console of his car. When he dropped me off at my parents' house, we sat in the driveway for a long time, neither of us wanting to let go. He said, I'll see you in 3 weeks when I move to the city. I said, I'll be there, I promise. He kissed me, long and slow, and I tried to memorize everything about that moment. Then he drove away and I stood there watching his car disappear, feeling like I was saying goodbye to one version of my life and hello to another. Those 3 weeks were hard. I was back in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by all the reminders of who I used to be, or who I used to pretend to be. But I had late-night phone calls with Mason, texts that made me smile, video chats where we'd fall asleep with our phones propped up so we could see each other, and I started having conversations I'd been avoiding. I told my best friend from high school, who was surprised but supportive. I told my older sister, who said she'd kind of wondered and was happy I'd found someone who made me happy. Telling my parents was harder. I waited until the day before I was supposed to leave for the city. We were having dinner, and I just blurted it out. I said, I need to tell you something. I met someone this summer. His name is Mason, and I'm in love with him. The silence that followed felt endless. My mum's eyes filled with tears, and for a horrible moment I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Then she said, Are you happy? I said, yes, happier than I've ever been. She said, then that's what matters. My dad took longer to come around. He didn't say much that night, just nodded and went quiet. But the next morning, as I was loading my car, he helped me carry boxes and said, This Mason, he treats you well? I said, He treats me like I matter, like I'm worth something. My dad nodded and said, Then I'd like to meet him sometime. It wasn't a full acceptance, but it was a start, and that meant everything. I drove to the city with my car packed full of everything I owned, nervous and excited and terrified. Mason had texted me his new address, said he'd be there waiting. When I pulled up to his building, he was sitting on the front steps, and the smile that lit up his face when he saw me made every fear worth it. I parked and got out, and he ran to me and picked me up and spun me around, both of us laughing. That first night in his tiny studio apartment, lying in his bed that was barely bigger than the twin bunks we'd shared at camp, he said, I can't believe you're really here. I said, Where else would I be? This is where I want to be. Where I'm supposed to be. He pulled me close and I rested my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, and thought about how far I'd come. From that first day at camp when I saw him in the sunlight, to this moment, building a life together in a city full of possibilities. It hasn't all been easy. Coming out is a process, not a single moment. I'm still figuring out how to exist in the world as someone who loves men, specifically as someone who loves Mason. There are awkward family dinners and uncomfortable conversations and moments when I still feel the urge to hide. But Mason is patient with me, and I'm learning to be patient with myself. We're building something real, something that started with a hand reaching out in the darkness and grew into love. Sometimes when we're lying together at night in our apartment, I think about that storm, that moment when everything changed. Mason's hand finding mine under the blanket, the bravery it took for him to reach out, the bravery it took for me to hold on. That simple gesture that said, I see you, I want you, I'm here. That's what love is, I think. It's reaching out even when you're scared. It's holding on even when it's hard. And it's choosing each other, over and over, in the big moments and the small ones. Mason is sleeping next to me now as I think about all of this, his breathing slow and even, his hand resting on my chest. In a few hours we'll wake up and make coffee, and argue about whose turn it is to do the dishes and plan our weekend and live our ordinary, extraordinary life together. And I'll be grateful every single day for that summer at camp, for thunderstorms and twin bunks and the courage to finally be honest about who I am and what I want. If you're reading this or listening to this and you're scared like I was, I want you to know it gets better. Not easier necessarily, but better, more real, more true. The fear doesn't disappear completely, but it gets smaller, and the love gets bigger, And eventually the love is so much bigger than the fear that the fear barely matters anymore. You deserve to be loved for exactly who you are. You deserve to reach out your hand in the darkness and have someone take it and hold on. That's my story. That's how my bunkmate's hand found mine under the blanket and changed everything. How a summer job became a summer of self-discovery, and how self-discovery became love, and how love became a life I actually want to live. I'm still figuring it out, still learning, still growing, but I'm doing it with Mason beside me, and that makes all the difference.